Hello and welcome to my home. Yes, it is nighttime. Hopefully, you guys do not mind. This is my bearded dragon pumpkin. She is tired and has decided to crawl onto my shoulder to go to sleep. So, as you can see, she's splooting, and there we go. She's resting. So, as long as you don't mind an extra visitor, we will get started. So, the point of this episode is to talk about the Protestant Reformation. Now, guys, this is a huge event, and I do mean huge. Why? Because we're going to start seeing modernity now. So this is going to really be something that starts to lead up to new ideas and up to modern concepts. I mean, it's a really cool and very exciting time. So when the world happens, once again, we have to rewind back to the 1300s. Remember in the 1300s, a couple things happened. Number one, you have the Avignonian papacy. So the Pope has become so powerful, and Catholicism is a state-based religion that has become so necessary that the French king, who is the number one king out there, decides that he must kidnap the Pope because he doesn't want his money and his resources leaving France, right? Because remember, as a country, you had to tithe. You had to tithe to Rome. Right? The Pope, had the ability to actually excommunicate kings. So what happens? There's a king who basically goes in, attacks Rome, kidnaps the Pope, brings him back to Avignon, where from about 1302 to 1373 plus or minus, there is a Pope not in Rome, but in France. So this becomes problematic, right? And on top of that, just, 50 years prior, we start getting critics of the church because the church, again, has become too worldly, too powerful. So you get folks like Meister Eckhart, a German who says, God's eye and my eye are one and the same. I don't need clergy to save my soul because God is within, right? That Holy Spirit notion. And you have Wycliffe, who says, from England, of course, with a name like Wycliffe, we need the Bible written in the vernacular of the people. Why is the Bible still in Latin, which nobody but the educated can read? The Bible in Latin is called the Vulgate because Vulgate meant for the commonly educated, right? So people were supposed to be able to read this. And now nobody could except for the elite, right? Then you get John Huss, who does something similar. He says the Pope is corrupt and we need to fix the church. Wycliffe dies, but is condemned after he dies. Meister Eckhart, I think he gets away with it, but his followers are drowned in the Rhine as witches. And John Huss is captured by the church as a heretic and burned at the stake. So dissenting from the church, not cool. So we've got the dissenting. Then we have the political element of a pope who is so powerful that the most powerful king of Europe kidnaps him and moves the dynasty to France. Well, eventually there is a pope who is elected who says, why am I in France? Why am I listening to the French king? I think I need to go back to Rome where I can be autonomous. And so he goes. And he elects a new college of cardinals. He brings some of his adherents with him. And the French are like, wait, what did he just do? And so they are like, obviously, this guy is a kookaloo. We are going to elect our own pope because obviously somehow that's a mistake. And so we now end up with two popes, the French pope and the Roman pope. And we did discuss this in prior videos. But if the Pope is supposed to be God's representative on earth, what do you do if there's two of them? Who's right? And remember that the Pope could excommunicate kings. And an excommunicated king kind of meant a lot more than you think. Meant your country could be excommunicated, right? Sorry. Listening to this is also this one. She found a toy. That's Penthusula. All right. On top of that is the Black Death, right? The bubonic plague moves in, and the church is not immune, right? During the bubonic plague, you actually had flagellants who would go through and they whipped themselves, right? They were supposed to be like scapegoats, absorbing the sins of villages to get rid of the plague, because obviously this was sent by God. So we have a very destabilized element in Europe at this point. But we get a nice charismatic pope who comes in and he's able to reunify the church, right? The other two popes go away. There's just one guy. And Europe is like, oh, okay. Whew. But it's kind of like when there are a few cracks and the cracks temporarily hold, but eventually they get bigger and bigger until the structure begins to fall apart. And that's what happens here. We get the Renaissance. There's a rise in humanism because carpe diem, right? Seize the day. For this morning, you may be eating breakfast with your relatives, and tonight you will be eating dinner with your ancestors, right? Life is short. There's new interest in learning. And in fact, during the Renaissance, we also have the addition of courts, right? There is kind of a new educated middle class in which, and I always love this, if you were a scholar, you didn't have to work at a university. You could be hired to teach privately in one of these upper level courts, the homes of nobility. And, if you have kids and your kids invite their friends over, you get a class, right? So you have family-based courtly learning going on now. And so instead of having to send people away, you could bring educators out. You were disseminating more information. So it's kind of cool stuff. We have a rise in art. We see art moving from a craft to an art, right, to its own field. We have named artisans who are associated with the products. They have a brand, right? So there's all of this going on. People feel good for a little while. Things start moving along. It's the age of exploration. 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. We get the rediscovery, if you will, of America. We have, and actually there is a period of time, this goes with your cultural collision element, in which essentially the Catholic Church had to determine whether or not indigenous people had souls, right? So that's something. Because if they did not have souls, they would have been subject to the rules of animals. And remember, at the time, animals were also considered not only to not have souls, but not to really have emotions either. And vivisection could happen, right? They weren't supposed to feel pain because only a soul-bearing being could, right? So this is pretty brutal. And once indigenous populations were deemed to have a soul, then this meant they had to be saved, right? They had to be converted. So that's happening. With the cultural collision element as well, there's a whole new source of semi-precious and precious minerals, metals, crystals, whatever you want to put in there, right? And in fact, the irony is that during the Renaissance, you have the early Renaissance, the high Renaissance, and the late Renaissance. The early Renaissance is in Florence. But the de Medici family, who brought the Renaissance to Florence, who create this new and fantastic idea of rebuilding your city and adding art to it and getting kudos. It's a very Roman idea. Well, this becomes significant because they start investing in items, in stones, in sculpture. And so you end up, I think it's a Cosimo, not the original, who has invested a lot of money in valuable items. But the problem with that is you can't get your money out of those items unless there's a buyer. It's during this time as well that once the early Renaissance shifts to the high Renaissance, the people who are going to take over the high Renaissance are going to be the popes. And so the early Renaissance artists who are in Florence, artists aren't stupid. They're going to go where the money is. So they go over to Rome, right? Michelangelo works for the Pope. Leonardo is doing things in Rome. I mean, this is just how it worked. Rome, in the meanwhile, is going to become interested in antiquities. Because remember, I mentioned that the Greco-Roman world is going to take on a new significance as perhaps a time period that should be emulated because God sent Jesus during the Roman Empire, right? So there's this connection to the divine. Okay. And in fact, it is during this time that the concept of a museum develops. So what do you do as you start finding all of these relics? Well, you start collecting them. You start ordering them. You start studying them. You put them on display for others to see and study. So we have the birth of the museum. I mean, it's a cool time. But cool times don't last. So if we kind of say the early Renaissance, we start seeing those seeds around the 1400 period. By 1517, the cracks are going to really begin to show again. And we end up with a guy by the name of Martin Luther, who is the fellow who exploded these cracks. So how did that happen? Martin Luther was a monk, and he was a junior professor at a new university in Wittenberg, Germany. You got to watch those professors. So his job is as a linguist. He translates the Bible. Now, the thing is that he and this other fellow by the name of Erasmus of Rotterdam, and I swear I will give you extra credit if you name your child Erasmus of Rotterdam, or as his proper name is, Desiderius Erasmus. Isn't that a cool name? I would like totally name a kid that. Desiderius Erasmus was another man who was a monk. He was well studied, and he became disillusioned with the church. Oh dear, this is going to be happening. And he and Martin Luther, Erasmus really, ends up trying to retranslate the Bible out of the Latin back to the Greek because it was originally Greek. And Martin Luther is part of this, right? He's studying the linguistics. He's translating the Bible from Latin into German because the German priests, they can't read Latin, right? It's fallen out of vogue. It's the educated language. So Martin Luther writes something called the 95 Theses. And the 95 Theses are a proposal to a reformation within the Catholic Church. Did he intend to create a new denomination? And the answer there is probably no. He really, this would be kind of like going to Reddit and putting out information and seeing what kind of discussion you got. So he went to the Cathedral of Wittenberg and he nails the 95 Theses up. But there's something that's a little bit different. There's something that's different now than 150 years ago when these other fellows were criticizing the church. And that is, number one, the rise of the humanistic element. Number two, the rise of the printing press. Martin Luther is the first Christian guy with pamphlets. So what ends up happening is people start reading the 95 Theses. And again, what Luther is expecting is like a debate. And instead, the church gets a hold of these and says, oh, he is saying that the church does not need a pope, that the church does not need indulgences because Jesus did stuff for free. And remember, indulgences are still in existence here, and they are big money, and they're paying for St. Peter's Basilica. And he says the most important part is faith, not good works. And the most important element is grace, because we're all sinners. And it's the grace of God that gets you saved, not the church. And he also says, yeah, that Wycliffe guy, we should have the Bible in the vernacular of the people. Right? And so instead of getting a debate, the church says, they call the Council of Worms, and it's spelled Council of Worms, so it looks like he's going to, go fishing or something. But they call the Council of Worms, and Martin Luther goes, and they say, either you recant this or you are excommunicated. And at this point in time, again, excommunication was very, very serious. And Martin Luther says, I will not recant. This assembly has no power over me. So he basically tells them, screw you, you're wrong. And Martin Luther might not actually be a bad translation, because Martin Luther, he actually does have table conversations essentially that do get written down, and he could be a little vulgar, he could be a little direct, shall we say. Okay. So they excommunicate him. Now, this is where things get very scandalous, because Martin Luther just takes it in stride, and he ends up marrying a nun who gets defrocked. And they have like 11 kids or something, and that was scandalous. A monk and a nun, oh my gosh. On top of that, remember how we mentioned there's a rise of secularism coming? Well, it's still there. So because we had the Pope who allowed the De Medici the De Medici Bank to charge interest on money loaned, that's secularism. That's a secular idea, because biblically, you're not supposed to do that. Humanism says that the individual is important because, dude, this is all we got. We're going to be dead soon, right? The human experience is significant. So the other thing is that if there is no pope, what happens to the power of the king? It increases. He doesn't have a boss anymore. He becomes the boss. Now, understand that part of the reason that Martin Luther probably got away with this, as he did, is that Germany was not the Germany we know today. Germany was a series of very small, almost like city-states all connected together. And he had allies. He had certain German princes who were like, hey, no pope? That does make me feel, makes me sound pretty good. And so he ultimately was protected. There were some people who would have persecuted him, some people who protected him. Whereas 150 years before, there would have been no question. So it means that something has happened. So now the ball is rolling, right? And it's going to get exciting from here. So I'm going to bring up, I hope this works. I'm going to bring up an image. Okay. And let me minimize this. Hoping is here. There it is. Okay. This is so cool. So in the beginning, you have Christianity, but Christianity has two heads, right? So you have the Western Church here and the Eastern Church here. In 1054, look at that date right there, there's a schism. When there's a schism, this basically means that they expected Jesus to come back, and he doesn't come back, at least as far as we know. And the Pope and the Patriarch disagree over who should be in charge. And so you end up with the Roman Catholic on one side and what becomes the Church of Constantinople, the Eastern Orthodox Church on the other. Now, the Eastern is going to go into Europe. So notice that you end up with the Eastern Orthodox Church in Cyprus, Russia, and Greece. And then the Armenian Church, the Coptic Church, which is actually older than this. So it's kind of weird that it pops in here. But the Coptic Church goes back to the 4th century. And then you're going to end up, again, more and more of these little divisions. But they're not really divisions. They are simply that adapts to the culture somewhat, right? They all answer the patriarch, but they have a cultural flavor. But, over here, see where it says, the 16th century Reformation divides the Church of Rome. Yep. And this is where things are going to get interesting. So now we have the Roman Catholic, which continues on. And look at how cute that is. There we go. And then we have the Protestant. So there is no longer a unified church, or there's no longer just two churches, right? Now we're going to start seeing branches. So Martin Luther is the first guy, right? And he creates Lutheranism, which gets adapted into Anglicanism. And then we're going to get this fellow by the name of John Calvin. John Calvin was about 10 years old when the Protestant Reformation started. And he grew up in what essentially is a religiously torn and divided Europe. So initially, the Catholic Church persecutes the Protestants, right? When we get down to Henry VIII, which hopefully we will, there's a period of time in which the Protestants are persecuted on behalf of the church, and then they're protected, and then they're persecuted again. It's wow, it's crazy. But anyway, see how exciting even the pugs are getting excited. I know, guys, it's cool. All right. Look at how really, really cool. Okay. Calvin's going to be an interesting guy. He grows up with a much darker point of view. He is going to come up with a type of Protestantism known as Calvinism, and it is going to be inherently dependent upon the doctrine of predestination. So essentially what he comes up with is this idea that there is a creator God who creates everything, and because God is omniscient, omnipresent, omnipotent, he already knows who's going to be saved and who is going to be condemned. And with the advancement of the Bible back in the vernacular, the people Calvin is highly interested in the 144,000 mentioned in Revelation. So he comes up with this idea that God has chosen 144,000 going from Adam until today, and that's it. Those are the saved. That's kind of an interesting, it's a little dark. It's a little bit of a darker vision because that would basically mean then that in creation, Godhead would know who is condemned and who isn't. So that, like if you were a parent and you gave birth and you would say, this child shall be saved, but its other 4 siblings that I've given birth to will not, right? And that's going to be an important thing shortly. So hold on to that idea. But the doctrine of predestination, the idea of being elect, the other thing is that if God is all-knowing, we are not. Which means that even though God knows who's saved, we do not, and therefore we need to behave as if we are saved. It's kind of a short version. Calvinism is going to inspire the Reformed churches. It's going to inspire another fellow by the name of John Knox, who comes up with Presbyterianism. And we're also going to see the rise of the Baptist churches. This branch will also have the Anabaptists, who believe in the separation of church and state. Ooh, why does that sound familiar? We're also going to eventually get a group called the Puritans. Oh, wait, what now? Who believe that the church needs to be purified. Yes, does this sound at all familiar? Right in time for Thanksgiving, right? We've got all of this coming down the road. There's going to be a fellow by the name of Zwingli in Sweden, who is more of a brimstone type of preacher. We're all going to hell except for, it's like, wow. Notice that we're going to start seeing branches. 1 Christianity, 2 Christianities, and now 3 Christianities, and 4 and 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So all of these are going to keep branching out. And notice, unlike the Orthodoxy here, where they all branch off of this, right? So they're all connected. Here there's disconnect. All right. And in fact, we'll talk about Henry VIII here. We get to the Anglican Church, the Church of England. The Church of England is going to become the product of politics. And this is how it happens. So there was Edward, I think it was Edward V, who was the elder brother to Henry VIII. Henry VIII was that kid that you had, the backup son, right? Or isn't it our current prince who has exiled himself to America? He wrote a book called Spare. Spare. He's the spare son. So you had the firstborn son who was guaranteed king, and then the secondborn in case something happened to the firstborn. Well, Edward is crowned. He is married to Catherine of Aragon of Spain, because we're still in a feudal system. This is the late Middle Ages, and feudalism is still there. And so the way you build up trade or connection through marriage, fidelity, right, and loyalty. So Spain and England need to forge some sort of alliance, and this marriage does it. Well, Edward unfortunately dies unexpectedly. Henry, who has been the spare son, ends up getting the crown. And he is kind of an interesting fellow, because initially he was a pretty jovial guy. He was incredibly athletic. But there are some indicators right now, and this was documented, that he got involved in a joust. And in this joust, he was knocked from the horse and he hit his head incredibly hard. And I think he was unconscious for like 4 days. And when he came out of that, unfortunately, it's kind of like football players, or now they're talking about people who come back from the military who have been exposed to a lot of concussive force, that there's literally a brain transformation, that there is something that happens to the brain and their personalities change. And it's at this point that Henry apparently becomes much meaner, if you will. He is married to Catherine of Aragon. The Pope actually does annul the first marriage to Edward so that Henry can marry her and we can keep this political liaison. And at one point, Henry was so passionate about the Catholic Church that he writes a defense of Catholic faith. And he is actually awarded a papal prize as a defender of the faith, right? Then whatever happened to Henry happened. Now, Henry does want a son. He does have a side chick who does give him a son, but the son is illegitimate. He is not acknowledged as a member of the throne. able to inherit the throne. And in fact, this son was the one healthy son that he had. He adored this young man, and his son died unexpectedly at 18, I think from a hunting accident. I'll have to look that up. Meanwhile, he's married to Catherine of Aragon. They seem to get along pretty well, but something has happened to him, and he is very much a changed man. He becomes more brutal. And it is not a happy marriage. And he orders Catherine to give him a son, and instead she gives birth to Mary. Now, before you think that is a weird thing, during the Renaissance, remember how I mentioned that men were considered to be the ones who gave babies souls, and women developed just the bodies. Yay. Well, that becomes significant because it was also believed that women and men had a hotter side and a cooler side. And this was incredibly important when it came to women, because after copulation, if the seed fell into the warmer side of their body, the right-hand side, they would give birth to a son. And if it fell into the left-hand side, the cooler side, because women were cool, not hot like men, right? Whatever. They would give birth to a daughter. So you were supposed to make sure, however you did it, that you had a son. And instead, he gets Mary. Well, he has his new side chick, and her name is Anne Boleyn, and Anne Boleyn is pregnant. And he's like, holy cow, this woman is going to she'll give me a son. And so he goes to the Pope and he asks the Pope for a divorce. And the Pope says, Henry, no, just annul. What? I'm not annulling your marriage. I'm not granting you a divorce. Just try again. Nothing wrong with the kid you got. But Henry doesn't want a queen, because a queen marries and the king would be from another country and would have power over that throne. So Henry says, remember, he's mean now, screw you, Pope, you're wrong. And he says, I am going to create my own religion. I am breaking with Roman Catholicism. And he creates the Church of England, where the head of the church is the king. That's an interesting little twist. You talk about a state religion. He ships his first wife off to Spain. He marries Anne Boleyn. From what I understand, too, Catherine was loyal to Henry for the rest of her life. I mean, it's kind of a sad thing. He marries Anne Boleyn, and Anne gives birth to a daughter. And they were so sure it was going to be a boy that literally they had to change the birth documents, because they all said he. They had to scratch through that and put she. Anne Boleyn does have a couple more kids, but they are stillborn. She does give birth to a son who doesn't live, right? He is stillborn. And so Henry has some charges trumped up that Anne and her brother are in an incestuous affair, and has them both killed. He marries again. This time, he does get the son he wants. Unfortunately, wife number 3 ends up dying, I believe, from childbed fever. But hey, she's produced Edward VI. Now, you have to keep all of this in the back of your mind, because this is a very tumultuous time. If you are Mary, or if you are Elizabeth, you are declared a royal bastard. And I can legitimately say that because it was a title. It meant that, yes, the king acknowledged you, but he also disavowed you from inheriting the throne. Henry reroutes everything around them. They were very much in mortal danger, because essentially they could have been seen as a threat to the throne. But he grants the throne to his son, Edward. Edward takes over upon Henry's death. And remember, Henry is unique because he's one of the first men in Western history to have 5 wives, right? He ends up marrying another Anne, and that doesn't work out because he's not attracted to her, essentially. He marries a young woman who's like 18 and beautiful, and then he catches her having an affair, because at this point, Henry, we believe, had gonorrhea. He had open pustules. So he has an STD. He would have open sores running down his leg, and it hurt and it stank. I mean, they literally had to like change his clothes, because of all the pus. I mean, you could, nope. So she gets caught having an affair and he has her killed. So, but he keeps getting to get wives. It's kind of fun, right? When he dies, the throne goes to Edward. Edward is a Protestant, right? So he only rules for, I want to say it's about 6 years. It's not tremendously long. But during this time, Mary gets married and somehow gets him to leave her the crown upon his death. She is actually next in line. He declares her his successor. And so Mary gets on the throne, and she is the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, who is Spanish and very, very devoutly Catholic. And so Mary is very Catholic too. And she looks at England and she's like, this is abhorrent. And she starts to force conversions back to Catholicism. It doesn't go well. She is called Bloody Mary because during her period, she probably killed between 500 and 800 of her own people that were Protestant that refused to convert back. She dies, I believe, of consumption, which is probably cancer or something along those lines. And you have to understand, Elizabeth at this, she's sweating it out because you have to understand, Elizabeth had it pretty rough. She had a stepmother at one point who was really good to her, really tried to protect her, treated her and Mary like her daughters. But there were also periods of time where she had to beg her father to send her money to get clothes. It was, I can't imagine the stress. And then becoming an adversary for the throne under Mary and trying to make sure she wasn't going to be killed, right? But somehow she gets the crown, right? Mary declares Elizabeth her successor. And Elizabeth is a smart cookie, and I'll get rid of this for a minute, because what she does is she says, you know what? Here's what we are going to do. We are going, let me stop sharing, sorry. We are going, I know there's never too much of a good thing. We are going to equalize things, and this is how we're going to do it. We are going to create the Book of Common Prayer. Everybody will belong to the Church of England. However, if you are in a more Catholic part of the church, of our area, you can have a more Catholic service. If you're in a more Protestant part of our area, you can have a more Protestant service, right? And so it becomes something that, ironically enough, stabilizes Europe. But in the meantime, understand that Protestantism is spreading. You have, there is so much that happens. In France, the king is an authoritarian, and he recognizes kind of the authoritarian nature of the Catholic Church of the time. And so he actually kicks out the Protestants. They become known as the Huguenots, the French Huguenots. So if you're a descendant of a Huguenot, it's because they left France and came to the Americas, because that's where you went. We get people leaving England, going to Switzerland, and from Switzerland to America, leaving Switzerland, going to England. England actually, the irony is that, in some ways, this period of time is kind of, it's a sect, S-E-C-T. It's a period of breakage within the Christian church. The original ideas are there. There's going to be a twist, okay? And so eventually you'll get the Quakers, the Shakers, the Society of Friends, Mother Ann Lee. Oh gosh, guys, it's so cool. There's so much stuff. And the religious wars are not going to end until 1648. Now, you can't let go of that because you're Catholic. What are you going to do? The Catholic Church does acknowledge the Protestant Reformation. And what they end up doing is something called the Counter-Reformation. So they call the Council of Trent, and there are 3 of these councils in which they sit down and they talk about all of the stuff. It's the Council of Trent that, number 1, stops the indulgence sales. Okay. That number 2 stops the complexity of the Catholic Church in the sense of the music was too complex, the art was becoming too complex. It says we need to simplify and go back to more of a churchly root. Okay. It's also going to say maybe the Protestants have something that lay people should be more involved in the church, that people outside of the clergy should be having roles within. They're also going to say, but the church is still needed for your salvation. No way to get around that. They're also going to create what are called the Jesuit order, right? And the Jesuits are going to be important because they become canonical lawyers and educators. So they become, in fact, there's a Jesuit high school. I went to Academy of the Holy Names down in Tampa. It was an all-girls Catholic school from which someday I will recover. But the sibling school, the brother school, was Jesuit high school, all boys. So the Jesuits are incredibly bright. They're also defenders of the faith, and they defend that faith through education. Interesting. Meanwhile, we're also going to have the rise of Galileo, who is part of the Inquisition, and the Inquisition develops during this time period. The Inquisition is trying to root out sinners, right? And Galileo is going to be one of the first guys. Now, people are like, "Oh, poor Galileo got excommunicated from the church. And he was arrested." And if you've ever actually studied how Galileo behaved, he was a jerk. He was rude. He was entitled. And he never apologized. He would not back down. So, I mean, I like him for that, but at the same time, it doesn't gain you many friends, and I totally get that. Okay. We're going to see the rise of Copernicus. And again, Copernicus is, so wait, what is this? This is science. Copernicus is going to start writing things like, the sun is the center of the universe. Now, is he right? No, but it's not the earth that's the center of the universe. And if you have never done this, read the introduction to Copernicus's book, because what he does is this. Number 1, he has his nephew smuggle it out, because he's in the Netherlands, which would be like the California of the time, very liberal thinking. He gives the book to his nephew and has his nephew smuggle it out so that he's not caught with it. And he says, wait 40 years to publish it. The nephew waits 40 years, publishes the book. In the introduction, it actually says, okay, well, before you excommunicate me, number 1, I could be wrong. I am merely an accountant. So he totally backpedals and he's like, I'm nobody. Number 2, he talks about all the people who read his book and thought maybe it has some value. And he names church people. So it's not only might I be wrong, but these people did read it and they thought it had some validity. I mean, it's really intriguing. I mean, how he pads things, but he still puts this information out. We're going to start seeing the advancement of the telescope, right? Looking out at Jupiter and discovering that Jupiter has moons, which means that the Earth is not unique anymore, right? So the church taught that the Earth was the only planet to have a moon, but now with the advent of the telescope that has existed but is now becoming so much more refined, not only the telescope going out, but even a proto-microscope sort of looking inward. Oh, wait, you look out and you look in. That's kind of the via moderna that's acknowledged after Thomas Aquinas, as this division of this understanding, this rise of interest in the world around you, because God creates both the world and humankind, right? Do you start to see how these little threads kind of come together? It's really fun. I love this stuff. It's like the best thing ever. So now we get to talk science. Now we get to talk about America. Now we get to start talking about us. And that's pretty cool. Maybe it's just me. Okay. So now that we have more or less gotten through the Reformation, there is one other guy I do want to talk about. Technically, he is more of an Enlightenment-based guy. So after the Renaissance, right, this movement forward, then you have the Reformation. Everybody's like, right? And then people kind of settle down, right? The religious wars end in 1648. People getting kicked over to America and all that sort of thing, Australia and Canada and wherever else. The rise of science, the rise of secularism, the rise of secular rulership, right? We're going to see in Europe, in Western history, in history in general, it's kind of like there's this dichotomous thing that happens. There's one side that does this and one side that does that, all right? Or there's almost a pendulum that swings back and forth. So we go from feeling pretty secure to feeling very insecure to kind of settling back down to going towards this intensity to going towards fluffiness, then going to, it's like back and forth, right? So you get the Baroque, right? That comes up next. And the Baroque is kind of fun. If it ain't Baroque, don't fix it. Ha ha. Sorry, humanities joke. The Baroque is going to be gaudy. There is going to be a fellow by the name of Louis the 14th. That could be just a little tiny bit important. Just saying. And then we get Louis the 15th and Louis the 16th. Ooh, what happens under Louis the 16th? Something about a Reformation, another one. So you had the Protestant Reformation, and then like 170 years later, there's these other Reformation, like revolutions, maybe. No longer religious, but now political. Okay. We're also going to be heading headlong into something called the Enlightenment. So the Baroque is about flashiness, less emotive, but more flashy. It's going to be kind of a counter to the turbulence of the Reformation. And from there, we do get a guy by the name of John Wesley. Okay, so Wesley, I'm just going to pop him in here with the Reformation people because he'll be important. But John Wesley is an Anglican. So he's from the Church of England. He comes over to America. He actually does preach in Georgia, and he fails miserably, and he goes back to England where he thinks about what happened. And the thing is that the Church of England has this predestination undertone that they kind of pull from Calvin a little bit. And Wesley doesn't agree with it. He doesn't. So what he ends up doing is coming up, and I mean, he studies this. He says, again, this would be a God that would make in creation people that he would have hated enough to condemn from their creation as he creates them, before he created them. This doesn't make sense. There's not enough about free will. So John Wesley starts looking at some of the pre-Reformation documents that are out there, and there's this guy by the name of Arminius. And he is from the Netherlands, and Arminius is all about free will. And John Wesley is going to pull on that idea of free will, that God closes his eyes to the future. I mean, I don't really have a better way to explain it, because technically, even closing your eyes to the future, I don't know how else to explain it. It's just an easy way. but God allows for free will to happen. And even though he knows exactly what's going to happen, he still lets free will happen. And you go with that. Which means that the individual is really responsible for their own salvation, and it does kind of launch off this more evangelical movement, right? The Methodists become the Methodists because John Wesley breaks with the Church of England, with the Anglican Church, and he creates something for the working class because he says that the Anglican Church has become too elite. And so he creates the Methodist Church, which is a form of methodical worship. And he also takes into account the Americas, where people are very spread out. And so he had what were called circuit riders, people who would go church to church to church to preach. All of that will be important because it will again be evangelical. And just in case you don't know, by the way, the Methodist Church is the parent to the Salvation Army, because there's a guy by the name of William Booth who in the 1800s believed that the Methodist Church had become too elitist, that it catered too much to the working class and left out the alcoholics, the poor, the disenfranchised, the women, because women could not be clergy. So you get the Salvation Army, which forms in the late 1800s, right? I mean, it's just so funny. And then that church becomes the parent to another church, right? So there's this continued schism. So yes, if you didn't know, the Salvation Army is actually a religion. It's a denomination. But what we're going to start to see is Protestantism that is able to divide and subdivide and divide again. And that'll be important. Okay. So I think for this module, since I am up to 51 minutes, well, I'll stop it here. Take a look throughout the module, see what you can find. And thanks so much for watching. Hopefully I'll catch you soon.